I am excited to share with you today about Christian families. And today we're going to be our topic is about ripples to the farthest shore. And this is really a topic that is dear to my heart. Now I have a question for you, children. Can you change it to the next slide? Thank you. Children, what do you do when you go to a lake or to a river and there's lots of rocks by that water? Just think of this little rock. Now, what if you're by this lake? What happens? Well, in my next slide, it shows you what usually happens with children. As soon as they get to the water, they pick up those rocks, and it's almost irresistible. They throw it right into the water. Now, children, when you throw a big rock into the water and it hits the water, what does it do? It goes splash. And when it goes splash, something else happens. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. When the ripple or when that rock or little pebble hits the water and it goes splash, from that little place where the rock hit, there begins to go ripples out further and further. We can throw a pebble into a lake and a wave is formed, and then another and another. And as they increase, the circle widens until it reaches the very shore. So with our influence, so with the influence of our families, beyond our knowledge or our control, it tells upon others in blessing or in cursing. So today we're talking about the rock of our families and the influence that they might be having. First of all, I would like to share with you some examples from the Bible of how pebbles were thrown into the lake and how they affected. First of all, we're going to be touching the life of Samuel. It says here in Samuel chapter 1, verse 24, that when Samuel was just a child, just a young child, his mother took him and dedicated him to the Lord to be in the temple. Samuel and Jesus have a lot in common. Can you give us the next slide? It says, as the child Samuel grew and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men. But it also says of Jesus that Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Even though Samuel was just a little boy, a young child, when his mother took him to the temple, she had faithfully trained him in the ways of the Lord, so that when he went to the temple, it says of him that he grew and was found in favor with the Lord and with men. And just as Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, Samuel increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Well, what was Samuel's environment? Well, it tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 12, and in that day I will perform against Eli all the things which I have spoken concerning his house. When I begin, I will also make an end. Okay, so he's talking, this is God talking about Eli, and Eli was a high priest, and this is where Samuel had been taken as a young child. Verse 13 says, for I have told him that I will judge his house forever, for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. So here we have, in this temple system, the high priest had two boys who were completely evil, at least two boys. He had sons. And these sons were vile and wicked, and Eli, the high priest, did not constrain them. He did not teach them in the ways of the Lord. He did not make sure they were going in the path of righteousness. And that is where little Samuel grew up from the time he was a young child. But even though Samuel grew up there, Samuel kept pure. Samuel kept true to God, and he increased in wisdom and stature like we read before. He continued growing with God. We have the little story of Samuel as he listened to God, remember, and he went to Eli and he said, speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. That precious story, in the midst of corruption, Samuel remained pure because of the training of his early years. And this shows the far-reaching influence of Samuel and his godly life. It tells us here in 1 Samuel 3:20, and all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. The entire country or nation of Israel understood that Samuel was to be God's prophet. And later in 1 Samuel 28:3, so this is at the end when Samuel has died, it tells us Samuel, now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. I know sometimes when people die that their entire family doesn't always come out to bury them, to grieve them. But in this case, an entire nation mourned because Samuel had such a far-reaching influence for good in the world. And that was begun at the knee of his mother. The next illustration we have is Daniel and his friends. And this is incredible because Daniel and his friends, in Daniel chapter 1, verse 4, it talks about us and it says, talks about Daniel and his friends, children in whom was no blemish. Who was this? What age were they? Were they well versed? It tells us they were children. Children. Just simply children. That is who was taken to Babylon. And Daniel and his friends were part of them. But it says children, well favored and skillful in knowledge and cunning in wisdom and understanding science, such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and tongues of the Chaldeans. Daniel and his friends were trained in a very godly home. They were trained to listen to the prophet Jeremiah, to heed what God had told them. And what happened with Daniel and his friends? As they went into Babylon and they were tempted and tested, this next slide tells us that, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Even though he was but a child, according to what the scriptures tell us, he was not willing to compromise what he had learned in his parents' home. And his parents weren't with him. They weren't there to say, oh, Daniel, remember, don't eat this meat. Don't drink that wine. That's not good for you. No, they had trained him when he was a little boy, and now he had purpose in his heart, even though he was still a child, that he was going to follow what he knew to be right. And what does it say in the next verse? Now God brought favor. It brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. God is going to make the way. As we train our children, he will make a way so that they will follow the truth as they're willing to stand up for it. Now Daniel and his friends, as they were in Babylon, it tells us that they had such a far-reaching influence. They followed God. They continued to follow him in every matter of conscience, of diet, of lifestyle. And as they did so, we find here in verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. And what does it say in verse 6, verse 3? Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was found in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. So Daniel and his friends, over and over again, they were established to the highest position in the kingdom. As they served and honored God, their influence grew just like the ripples of the sea. Little Maid. We don't know much about Little Maid, but we know that she was captured and she was brought to a Syrian home and served as Naaman, who was captain of the guard, served as his wife's maid. And as she served there, God brought her into opportunities to not worship the idols, but she chose to worship the true God, which her father and her mother had taught her. And in a time when Israel was in apostasy and Israel was going away from God, her parents had trained her to serve the one true God. How do we know this? This is because of her response when she's away from her parents. When her parents are telling her, remember, little maid, don't do this, and remember, little maid, be good. Away from that influence, she still stood. And what did she say? She said to her mistress, would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria. Does she have high regard for God's truth and his way? Yes, she does. For he would recover him of his leprosy. In a time when Israel was going away, Little Maid's parents raised her in the God of the Lord and of the Bible and taught her the ways of righteousness. And she shared that to where a captain was healed of his leprosy in a foreign land. far-reaching influence. Moses was raised in a time of slavery, would you change the slide? Thank you. In a time of apostasy, where, well, at least of slavery, where the entire nation he was born into was under oppression, was being treated roughly and not as they deserved. And God preserved Moses during this time. And he made sure that the child was able to be with his mother for his first little while. And it tells us in Exodus chapter 2, verse 10, and the child grew, and she, that's the Pharaoh's daughter, she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter. She became her son, and he called his name Moses. And she said, because I drew him out of the water. Now, in this time when Moses' mother was a slave, she still took time to teach her children the ways of righteousness. Until this is so incredible. What does it say next of Moses? It tells us in the next slide that Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. How many of our young people are choosing the pleasures of sin? But as Moses had it laid all before him, he could do whatever he wanted. He had all the riches of the nation behind him. He chose to suffer affliction with the people of God, esteeming the reproaches of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he had respect unto the recompense of reward. He had in his mind what Christ was having in store for each one of his children who followed him, the recompense of the reward. Moses became the leader in Israel. Next slide. He really became the one that led Israel to the promised land. He was not able to lead them all the way through, but for 40 years, he faithfully led Israel. And he had a great impact that when he died, all Israel wept. They were extremely sad because he was their beloved leader and guide. Now, what about the parents of John the Baptist? It tells us of the parents that there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, of the course of Abiah, and his wife of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So we have Zachariah and Elizabeth, and they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. So they are following the Lord as best as they know how. What does it tell us of John the Baptist? John the Baptist, growing up in this influence, growing up in a Christian home where they faithfully taught him the ways of the Lord, it says, verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there has not risen a greater than John the Baptist. What made him so great? It was him following his early training where his parents faithfully taught him the ways of the Lord. Notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So God has said of John the Baptist that he was the greatest that had walked among us. And it was because of his early training. He had a great influence. A little later, we have the story of Timothy. And Timothy, it's incredible. It says, when I call to remembrance the unfeigned faith that is in thee, which dwelt first in thy grandmother Lois and in thy mother Eunice, and I am persuaded that is in thee also. His mother and his grandmother committed to him the faithful oracles of God and truly taught him the scriptures. The next verse goes on to describe even clearer. And that from a child thou hast known the holy scriptures, which are able to make thee wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. Truly, as a child, they could know the Holy Scriptures, and Timothy did, and it made him a faithful man of God. Now, what was Timothy's home life like? It says a champion from a broken home is what I have here, and it tells us that they came, and Timotheus, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jewish and believed, but his father, what was his father? His father was a Greek. He was in a broken home. He was in an experience where his mother believed and his father did not. And yet from there, it tells us in the next verse, which was well reported of the brethren. There were at Lystra and Iconium. He had a good report because he chose the ways of righteousness. Mothers, fathers, if you're in a broken home where only one of you believe, you still can raise godly children because Timothy, a soldier, a champion of the cross, came from a broken home, but his mother taught him. And if you're a father, you can still teach the ways of righteousness. Now, as we're looking at all this beautiful influence that a Christian home can have, raising up children in righteousness, we must also realize that if we throw a pebble of wickedness into a lake, a pebble will make ripples. And those ripples will go to the farthest shore, whether it is a pebble of righteousness or a pebble of wickedness. And that's what happened with Manasseh. Manasseh, it tells us, so Manasseh made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to err, and to do worse than the heathen whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. He was a pebble of wickedness, and he was thrown into society, and it said that he made all Israel to err, to do worse than the heathen. It goes on to say, and the Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they would not hearken. So God is seeking to plead with them, but they would not listen. And it goes on, wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns, and bound him with fetters, and carried him to Babylon. Manasseh, this pebble that was thrown into society, he was wicked, and he led the children of Israel into wickedness. And he caused all of Israel to go captive. And in the next slide, it tells us, in Leviticus, this is what God's promise was. He said, if you will not hearken unto me and will not do all these commandments, and if you will despise my statutes, or if your soul abhor my judgments, so that you will not do all my commandments, that ye break my covenant, which Manasseh had caused the children of Israel to do, what would be the results? Would you click it again so they can see the second thing? Thank you. I will make your cities waste, and bring your sanctuaries unto desolation, and I will not smell the savor of your sweet odors. And I will bring the land into desolation, and your enemies which dwell therein shall be astonished at it. And I will scatter you among the heathen, and will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. This was the terrible curse that was to come upon the land. And as this stone was thrown into society of wickedness, we can look at many, many examples, but this is just one. That we have a far-reaching influence, and how we raise our children has a far-reaching influence. Proverbs chapter 22 verse 6 tells us, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Most of these examples of the godly young people, they were in their Christian homes just a short little while. Some of them only 3 years, some of them maybe more like 12, but each one of them stood faithful and strong amidst temptation, amidst desolation, amongst the corruption of the enemy. And your children, if you're listening, you can stand strong. Parents, you can train children to stand strong for God, though the heavens fall. Can you go to the next slide? If we will open our hearts and our homes to the divine principles of life, we shall become channels of life-giving power, just like Daniel was, just like Samuel was, just like Joseph was, just like Timothy was, just like John the Baptist was. From our homes will flow streams of healing, bringing life and beauty and fruitfulness where now are barrenness and death. Picture your family for just a moment, being the blessing that heaven intended it to be, sharing with others the joy of the Christian life because you have let the beauty of Christ's character into your homes, have adopted its principles, and are living it out, that your children may be a blessing. Now let's look at the opposite. The influence of an ill-regulated home is widespread and disastrous to all society, just like Manasseh. It accumulates in a tide of evil that affects families, communities, and governments just like a tidal wave. And as destructive as this tidal wave is, as we're looking at this tidal wave, can you imagine being a poor person who is standing on the road just where that water is breaking. That will destroy you. My brothers and sisters, you can go to the next slide. We have the blessed privilege of being the stream of healing or a tidal wave of woe. What will we choose? By God's grace, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And I pray that that will be the prayer of each one of you, that you would be an influence for good in the world. That as we go out and throw those little rocks, those little pebbles into the water, that we would remember, God has given me an influence. Will I be a tidal wave of woe, or will I be a stream of healing virtue? I pray that each one of us will choose to be that stream of healing virtue.
Amen.
Next, we have the health nugget. And today I'm excited to talk to you about a subject that I really enjoy. And first of all, we're going to put